thought I knew my family. I thought I understood the dynamics of my marriage, my role as a stepmother, and my place in this house. But what happened between me and my stepson shattered everything. If someone had told me that one day I'd beg for the chance to take it all back, I wouldn't have believed them. My name is Sarah. I'm 36 years old, a second wife to an amazing man named John. He's a brilliant attorney, often working late or traveling for cases. And then there's Alex, John's 20-year-old son from his first marriage. He's polite, intelligent, and well, normal. Or so I thought. John and I had been married for 3 years, and for the most part life was good. I had a stable career, a beautiful home, and a family dynamic that worked, even if it wasn't traditional. Sure, Alex moved in with us halfway through college when his mother relocated, but I didn't mind. I welcomed him with open arms. I told myself I wanted to be a supportive stepmother, someone he could rely on. Little did I know, I was opening a door I'd later wish had stayed shut. At first, everything seemed fine. Alex was reserved but respectful. We didn't have a lot in common, but we coexisted peacefully. He spent most of his time studying, working out, or gaming in his room. Typical college kid stuff. I thought nothing of it. But then things started to change. It began with the little things. I would catch him staring at me just a second too long during dinner. Or he'd make a point of complimenting me on things John wouldn't notice. Like the way I styled my hair or a new pair of earrings. I brushed it off as harmless. Maybe he was just trying to be nice. But deep down, something about it felt off. One evening, John was working late, and I was scrolling through my phone on the couch. Alex walked in and sat across from me. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me. There was a strange tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. I smiled politely and asked him about his classes, trying to make casual conversation. He answered in short sentences, but his eyes never left mine. I started to feel self-conscious, so I set my phone down and tried to excuse myself, but before I could, he stood up abruptly and left the room. When I picked up my phone again, I noticed something strange. One of my photos from a recent vacation was still open on the screen. It wasn't just any photo. It was me in a swimsuit lounging by the pool. My stomach flipped. Had I opened this by mistake? Or had Alex seen it? I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Maybe I was being paranoid. But the image of his intense gaze lingered in my mind. The next day, something even stranger happened. I walked past the bathroom and noticed the door was slightly ajar. I didn't mean to look inside, but something caught my eye. Alex was standing in front of the mirror, holding something. At first, I thought it was just a towel or a shirt. But as I looked closer, I realized it was one of my scarves. He was holding it up to his face, breathing it in. My heart started racing and I quickly stepped away, hoping he hadn't seen me. I didn't know what to think. Was this just some innocent habit? Was I making something out of nothing? Or was there more to this than I wanted to admit? That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Alex standing there, holding my scarf. I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to make sense of it. I told myself I was overreacting. Alex was just a young man, probably going through a phase. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was imagining things. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And as I would soon find out, this was only the beginning. A few days later, John had to leave for another business trip. It was just me and Alex at home. I tried to keep myself busy, cleaning the house and running errands. But every time I saw Alex, I felt this strange energy between us. It was subtle, but it was there. He started finding excuses to be around me more. Offering to help with dinner, asking me about my day, even sitting closer to me on the couch when we watched TV. I told myself he was just being friendly, but part of me wondered if it was something more. That evening, I was in the kitchen when Alex came in. He stood next to me, watching as I chopped vegetables. I could feel his eyes on me, and it made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't explain. I tried to act normal, asking him if he wanted to help. He smiled and nodded, stepping closer. For a moment, everything felt normal. But then his hand brushed against mine and I froze. It wasn't accidental. I could feel the deliberate nature of the touch, the way he lingered just a second too long. My heart raced and I quickly pulled my hand away. "Sorry," he said softly, but his tone didn't match his words. There was something in his voice, something that sent a chill down my spine. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the tension. It's fine, I said, avoiding his gaze. But my hands were trembling, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. After dinner, I went to my room and locked the door. I needed space, time to think. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that Alex didn't mean anything by it. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. This wasn't just in my head. Something was happening. Something I couldn't ignore. The next morning, I found a note on the kitchen counter. It was from Alex. He thanked me for dinner and said he appreciated having someone to talk to. It seemed innocent enough, but the way he wrote it felt personal. Intimate. My chest tightened as I read the words, and for the first time, I realized just how deep this situation might go. I didn't know it then, but the events that followed would push me to the brink. I would soon learn the truth about Alex's intentions, and my own feelings would become harder to ignore. What happened next would make me question everything I thought I knew about my family, my marriage, and myself. I wasn't planning to snoop. Honestly, I wasn't. But that morning, Alex had left his door slightly open, and something inside me told me to take a look. Maybe it was the tension I'd been feeling lately, or maybe it was just my own paranoia. Either way, I stepped inside. His room was neat, almost too neat for a 20-year-old. The bed was perfectly made. His desk was organized, and his laptop sat in the center, its screen dark. I hesitated for a moment, telling myself to walk away. But instead I moved closer. My heart pounded as I lifted the lid of his laptop, the screen flickering to life. What I saw stopped me cold. It was a folder, labeled innocuously enough, just photos. But when I clicked it open, I realized it wasn't just any photos. They were all of me. Pictures from family trips, casual moments in the kitchen, even candid shots I didn't remember anyone taking. My throat tightened as I scrolled through image after image. Some of the photos were innocent, sure, but others not so much. There was one of me in a sundress leaning over the counter. Another of me at the pool in a swimsuit. I couldn't breathe. My first thought was disbelief. How could Alex have these? Why would he save them? Then a darker thought crept in. Had he taken some of these himself? I slammed the laptop shut, my hands trembling. My mind raced with questions I wasn't ready to answer. I knew I should confront him, but how? What would I even say? When Alex came home that evening, I was waiting for him. My stomach churned as I sat on the couch trying to keep my composure. Alex, can we talk? I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. He hesitated, then nodded, sitting down across from me. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his posture, a wariness that only made my heart beat faster. I need to ask you something, I began, choosing my words carefully. I saw some pictures on your laptop. Pictures of me. His eyes widened for just a fraction of a second before he looked away. It's not what you think, he muttered. What am I supposed to think, Alex? My voice cracked and I hated myself for it. Why do you have those photos? Why would you save them? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair, avoiding my gaze. You wouldn't understand, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Try me, I pressed, leaning forward. But he just shook his head. It's not like that, Sarah. I swear. It's complicated. I wanted to scream, to demand answers. But the way he looked at me, the vulnerability in his eyes, made me pause. He seemed almost scared. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation. His words echoed in my mind, and the look on his face lingered long after I went to bed. Part of me wanted to believe him, to brush it off as a misunderstanding. But another part of me, the part that had seen those photos, knew better. And then there was something else, something I didn't want to admit. I wasn't just angry or confused. I was flattered. It was a terrible thought, one that made me sick to my stomach. But it was there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The way Alex looked at me, the intensity in his voice. It stirred something inside me that I couldn't ignore. This is wrong, I told myself, gripping the edge of my bed. He's my stepson. I'm married. This can't happen. But no matter how hard I tried to push the thoughts away, they kept coming back. His gaze, his words, his presence, it was all too much. The next day, I avoided him as much as I could. I stayed busy, cleaning the house and running errands, anything to keep my mind off of him. But when I walked into the kitchen that afternoon and found him sitting at the table, I felt my resolve weaken. He looked up as I entered, his eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The air between us was heavy, charged with something I didn't want to name. "About last night," he began, his voice soft. "Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "We don't need to talk about it." "But I need you to know." I said don't. I snapped more forcefully than I intended. He flinched and I immediately felt guilty. But before I could say anything else, he stood up and left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That evening I sat on the couch, staring at the television without really watching it. My mind was a mess, a jumble of emotions I couldn't untangle. Anger, confusion, guilt, and something else, something I didn't want to name. When Alex walked into the room and sat down beside me, I felt my pulse quicken. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body. "Sarah," he said quietly, turning to look at me. I didn't respond. I couldn't. "I want you to know I'm sorry," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." I looked at him, then really looked at him, and for the first time I noticed things I hadn't before. The sharp line of his jaw, the way his eyes softened when he spoke, the quiet intensity in his voice. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't just flattered. I was attracted to him. The realization made my stomach churn, and I immediately stood up, putting distance between us. "I need to go to bed," I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. As I walked to my room, I could feel his eyes on me, and my heart raced in a way it hadn't in years. When I closed the door behind me, I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My thoughts were a whirlwind, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of Alex's face, the sound of his voice, the way he looked at me. "This is wrong," I whispered to myself over and over again. But deep down, I knew it was only going to get worse, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to stop it. That evening felt ordinary at first. John was out of town again, tied up with another case, leaving just Alex and me in the house. I had spent most of the day avoiding him, throwing myself into errands and chores. But by the time dinner rolled around, I couldn't avoid him anymore. I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables when Alex walked in. His presence felt heavy, like the air had shifted. I didn't turn to look at him, but I knew he was watching me. "Need help?" he asked, his voice casual. I hesitated. "Sure," I said, keeping my eyes on the cutting board. He moved closer, standing right next to me at the counter. Too close. I could feel the warmth of his body beside mine, and it made my heart beat faster. He reached for a knife and started slicing the carrots, his movements deliberate. For a while we worked in silence. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of the knives against the cutting board, and the occasional rustle of vegetables. But the tension in the room was palpable. Then out of nowhere his hand brushed against mine. It was brief, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. I glanced at him, expecting him to apologize or laugh it off, but he didn't. Instead, he met my gaze, his expression unreadable. I turned back to the vegetables, trying to focus. "Careful," I said, my voice a little too high-pitched. "You don't want to cut yourself." "I'm careful," he said softly. His tone made my stomach flutter in a way I hated to admit. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing. Just a harmless touch. Just an innocent moment. But deep down I knew better. As we finished preparing the meal, I felt his eyes on me more than once. Every glance, every accidental touch, felt loaded with something unsaid. By the time we sat down to eat, I was on edge, my thoughts racing. "Dinner looks great," he said, breaking the silence. "Thanks," I replied, avoiding his gaze. For a while we talked about mundane things, his classes, his plans for the weekend. I tried to keep the conversation light, but every time I looked at him, I felt that same tension. It was like there was an invisible thread pulling us closer, no matter how hard I tried to resist. When we finished eating, he stood up to clear the plates. "You don't have to do that," I said quickly, standing as well. "I want to," he replied, smiling. As he reached for my plate, our hands touched again. This time, neither of us moved away. My breath hitched, and for a moment I couldn't move. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice low and serious. I looked up at him, my heart pounding. "What?" He hesitated, as if he was deciding whether or not to say what was on his mind. Then finally he spoke. "You've always been more to me than just my dad's wife." His words hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. I felt my face flush, a mixture of shock, anger, and something I didn't want to name. "That's not appropriate, Alex," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm just being honest," he said, his gaze unwavering. I stepped back, putting space between us. "This conversation is over," I said firmly. But as I walked out of the kitchen, my thoughts were a mess. His words echoed in my mind, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the way they made me feel. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the moment in the kitchen. His voice, his eyes, the way he said my name, it was all too much. "This is wrong," I whispered to myself over and over. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, a part of me couldn't help but wonder, what if he meant it? What if he wasn't just being impulsive? The next morning I tried to act normal. I went about my day as if nothing had happened, keeping my distance from Alex as much as possible. But he didn't make it easy. He found excuses to be near me, asking questions about the house, offering to help with chores. Every time he spoke to me, his tone was soft, almost tender. And every time he looked at me, I felt a pull I couldn't explain. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that he didn't really mean what he said. But then that afternoon he proved me wrong. I was folding laundry in the living room when he walked in and sat down on the couch. For a while he didn't say anything, just watched me. I tried to ignore him, but I could feel his eyes on me, and it made my skin prickle. "Sarah," he said finally. "What is it, Alex?" I asked, not looking at him. "I meant what I said last night," he said, his voice calm but firm. I froze, the shirt I was folding slipping from my hands. "You shouldn't have said it," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he admitted, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. I turned to face him then, my heart racing. "This has to stop, Alex. Whatever you think you feel, it's not real." "It feels real to me," he said, his gaze intense. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt charged, like a storm was about to break. I shook my head, forcing myself to look away. "This conversation is over," I said, grabbing the laundry and leaving the room. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. That morning, I stood in front of my closet longer than usual. My hand hovered over a simple blouse and jeans, my usual choice for a quiet day at home. But instead I reached for the red dress. It wasn't anything too revealing, but it clung to my figure in just the right places. I told myself it was just a change of pace, something to lift my mood, but deep down I knew the truth. I wanted Alex to notice. As I walked into the kitchen, I could feel his eyes on me immediately. He didn't say anything at first, just watched as I moved around the room, pretending to be busy. My heart raced under his gaze, and I hated how much it thrilled me. "You look nice today," he said finally, his voice soft but deliberate. "Thanks," I replied, trying to sound casual. But I could feel my cheeks flush, and I turned away quickly to hide it. Throughout the day, I found myself paying more attention to him than I wanted to admit. The way his shirt fit, the way he ran his hand through his hair when he was deep in thought. It all seemed so much more noticeable now. And the worst part was I didn't hate it. Later that afternoon, Alex found me in the living room. He was holding a small box wrapped neatly with a ribbon. "What's this?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just something I thought you'd like," he said, handing it to me. I hesitated before taking it, my heart pounding. Slowly, I pulled the ribbon loose and opened the box. Inside was a delicate necklace, a thin gold chain with a tiny pendant shaped like a heart. "Alex," I began, my voice shaking. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he interrupted, his eyes locking onto mine. "It reminded me of you. Simple but beautiful." His words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. "You shouldn't have," I managed to whisper, my fingers brushing against the pendant. "Do you like it?" he asked, stepping closer. I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "It's lovely," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let me help you put it on," he offered, reaching for the necklace. Before I could protest, he was behind me, his fingers brushing against my neck as he fastened the clasp. I shivered at his touch, my breath catching in my throat. "There," he said softly, stepping back. "It suits you." I turned to face him, my hands instinctively going to the necklace. Alex, this is too much, I said, my voice trembling. It's just a gift, Sarah, he said, his tone calm but firm. You deserve it. The way he looked at me then, so intense and unwavering, made my knees feel weak. I knew I should say something, draw a boundary, but I couldn't. Instead, I found myself saying, "Thank you." That evening, I couldn't stop touching the necklace. Every time I caught a glimpse of it in the mirror, I felt a pang of guilt mixed with something I couldn't quite name. When Alex joined me in the kitchen for dinner, the tension between us was almost unbearable. He sat across from me, his gaze never straying far. Every time our eyes met, my heart raced. After dinner, we ended up in the living room. I was sitting on the couch and he was in the armchair across from me. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioner. "Sarah," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Yes," I asked, looking up. "Do you ever think about what it would be like if things were different?" My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "If we weren't in this situation. If we were just two people, without all the complications." "Alex," I began, shaking my head. "That's not something we should talk about." "Why not?" he pressed, leaning forward. "I know you feel it too. The connection between us. It's not just me." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My pulse quickened and I felt my resolve slipping. "This isn't right," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I'm married, Alex. Your father." "I know," he interrupted, his voice firm. "But you can't tell me you haven't thought about it. About us." I opened my mouth to protest, but no words came out, because the truth was I had thought about it, more than I wanted to admit. For a moment, the room felt impossibly small. The space between us seemed to disappear, and I could feel the pull, the magnetic force drawing us closer. He stood up and took a step toward me, and for a second I thought I might let him. My heart raced, my mind screaming at me to stop, but my body refused to move. But then at the last moment I stood up and backed away. "I can't," I said, my voice breaking. "Sarah," he began, reaching for me. "No," I said firmly, shaking my head. "This has to stop. Whatever this is, it's not going to happen." The look on his face was a mix of disappointment and something deeper, something I couldn't name. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't." I turned and walked out of the room, my hands shaking. As I closed the door to my bedroom behind me, I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Guilt, confusion, and something dangerously close to regret. I knew I had done the right thing, but it didn't feel like enough. Lying in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That no matter how hard I tried to resist, Alex wasn't going to let this go. And part of me wasn't sure I wanted him to. That evening, the house was eerily quiet. John was away again, and the emptiness of the space seemed to amplify everything. I tried to keep myself busy, cleaning, organizing, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, but nothing worked. My thoughts kept circling back to Alex, to the way he had looked at me, to the words he had spoken. I told myself to avoid him, to stay in my room and wait for the night to pass. But when I heard him moving around in the kitchen, I felt a pull I couldn't ignore. I found him standing by the counter, pouring himself a glass of water. He looked up as I entered, and for a moment we just stared at each other. The silence between us was thick, charged with something unspoken. "Can't sleep?" he asked, breaking the tension. I shook my head. "No. You?" He shrugged, setting the glass down. "Not really." I hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Part of me wanted to leave, to run back to the safety of my room. But another part of me, the part one hated to admit existed, wanted to stay. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. My pulse quickened and I felt rooted to the spot. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice low and steady. "What?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "I know you feel it too," he said, his eyes locked onto mine. I opened my mouth to protest, to deny it, but no words came out, because the truth was I did feel it. The pull, the connection, the tension that had been building between us for weeks. Before I could stop him, he reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from my face. His touch sent a shiver down my spine, and I hated how much I wanted him to keep going. "This is wrong," I said, my voice barely audible. "Then tell me to stop," he replied, his gaze unwavering. I couldn't. He leaned in slowly, giving me every chance to pull away. But I didn't. When his lips finally met mine, it was like something inside me snapped. I stopped thinking, stopped resisting, and let myself get lost in the moment. For a brief, intoxicating time, nothing else mattered. But as soon as it was over, reality came crashing back in. I pulled away abruptly, my heart pounding. We can't," I stammered, stepping back. "Sarah," he began, reaching for me. "No," I said firmly, shaking my head. This was a mistake. A huge mistake. I turned and fled the room, my thoughts racing. By the time I reached my bedroom, I could barely breathe. What have I done? I whispered to myself, sinking onto the edge of the bed. The guilt hit me like a tidal wave, suffocating and relentless. I thought about John, about the vows I had made, about everything I stood to lose. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The memory of what had happened was fresh, raw, and impossible to ignore. The next day, I avoided Alex as much as I could. I stayed in my room pretending to be busy with work, but I could feel his presence on the other side of the door. He knocked once softly, but I didn't answer. "Sarah," he called quietly. I didn't respond. After a few moments, I heard his footsteps retreating, and I let out a shaky breath. But the relief was short-lived. I knew this wasn't over. Over the next few days, Alex became more persistent. He found excuses to be around me, to talk to me, to bring up what had happened. "You can't just pretend it didn't happen," he said one afternoon, cornering me in the hallway. "I can and I will," I replied, avoiding his gaze. "You felt it too," he said, his voice insistent. "I know you did." "Alex, stop," I said firmly, stepping past him. "This has to stop." But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. The memory of that night haunted me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feelings it had awakened. I hated myself for it. I hated how weak I felt, how easily I had given in. But most of all, I hated the way a part of me didn't want to let it go. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, staring out the window. The guilt was eating me alive, and I knew I had to do something. "I have to end this," I whispered to myself, "before it's too late." But deep down, I wasn't sure if I had the strength to follow through. And as I would soon learn, Alex wasn't about to make it easy for me. The guilt was unbearable. Every moment I spent in the house felt like the walls were closing in on me. I avoided Alex as much as possible, but he made it clear he wasn't going to let this go. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, he cornered me in the kitchen. His presence was heavy, suffocating, and I knew this conversation was going to be different. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'm not," I replied quickly, my hands trembling as I wiped the counter. "Don't lie to me, Sarah," he said, stepping closer. "You think you can just pretend nothing happened? That we can go back to normal?" I turned to face him, anger bubbling to the surface. "We have to go back to normal, Alex. What happened was a mistake. A huge mistake." He didn't flinch, didn't back down. Instead, he crossed his arms and stared at me, his gaze unwavering. "I don't think it was a mistake," he said, his tone calm but firm. "And I don't think you do either." "Stop," I said, my voice trembling. "This ends now. Whatever you think this is, it's over." But then he said something that sent a chill down my spine. "If you end it," he said softly, leaning in closer, "I'll tell John everything." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "You wouldn't," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Try me," he replied, his eyes locking onto mine. My mind raced, panic setting in. The thought of John finding out about what had happened made my stomach churn. I could lose everything, my marriage, my home, my life as I knew it. "You wouldn't dare," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't want to," Alex said, his tone almost gentle. "But you're leaving me no choice." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, to slap him, to do anything to make him stop. But I couldn't, because deep down I knew he wasn't bluffing. The next few days were a nightmare. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Alex was everywhere, always watching, always waiting. and no matter how hard I tried to ignore him, I couldn't escape the weight of his presence. I started to hate him, but more than that, I hated myself. For letting this happen, for not being stronger, for not stopping it before it was too late. One afternoon as I was folding laundry, I heard John's voice from the hallway. "You've been quiet lately," he said, stepping into the room. I forced a smile, my hands fumbling with the shirt. "Just busy, I guess." He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Is everything okay?" "Of course," I replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. He didn't say anything for a while, and the silence was deafening. Finally, he sighed and walked over to me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You know you can talk to me, right?" he said softly. "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But as he walked away, I felt a pang of guilt so intense it nearly brought me to my knees. I couldn't keep living like this. That evening, I decided to confront Alex. I found him in his room, sitting on the bed with his laptop. He looked up as I entered, a smirk playing on his lips. "We need to talk," I said firmly, closing the door behind me. "About what?" he asked innocently, setting the laptop aside. "You can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. "You can't keep holding this over me." He stood up, his expression darkening. "I'm not holding anything over you, Sarah. I just want you to stop pretending." "Pretending what?" I snapped, my anger finally boiling over. "Pretending you don't want this as much as I do," he said, stepping closer. "I don't," I said, my voice breaking. "I regret everything that happened. I just want my life back." He shook his head, a bitter smile on his lips. "It's not that simple." "It is," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You just have to let me go." For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then he stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Fine," he said quietly. "Have it your way." But as I left his room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The next day, I overheard John on the phone. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but his voice carried through the hallway. "I don't know," he was saying. "Something feels off. She's been acting strange lately." My heart sank, panic setting in. Was he talking about me? Did he suspect something? "I'll talk to her," he said finally. "Maybe it's nothing." I quickly stepped away, my mind racing. If John was already suspicious, it was only a matter of time before he started asking questions. And if Alex followed through on his threat, my entire life could come crashing down. I couldn't take it anymore. The guilt was unbearable, suffocating. Every day felt like a ticking time bomb. And I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. That evening, as John sat in his study working, I stood outside the door, my heart pounding. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of saying it out loud made me feel sick. Still, I couldn't live like this anymore. I knocked softly, and he looked up, surprised to see me. "Hey," he said, smiling. "What's up?" "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice trembling. "Sure," he replied, setting his papers aside. "What's on your mind?" I sat down across from him, unable to meet his eyes. My hands were shaking and my chest felt tight. "There's something I need to tell you," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something I've been keeping from you." The smile faded from his face, replaced by a look of concern. "Sarah, what is it?" I took a deep breath, tears welling up in my eyes. "It's about Alex," I said finally. For a moment he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then his brow furrowed, and he leaned forward. "What about Alex?" I told him everything. Every painful, humiliating detail. My voice cracked as I spoke, and by the time I finished I was crying uncontrollably. "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said, my voice breaking. I didn't want it to go this far." He didn't say anything for a long time. The silence was deafening, each second stretching out like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and sharp. "You betrayed me," he said, his words cutting like a knife. "You betrayed us." "John, please," I begged, reaching for him. "I'm so sorry. I'll do anything to make this right." He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. "Make this right," he repeated, his voice rising. "How do you think you can make this right, Sarah? You destroyed our family." "I love you," I said desperately. I don't want to lose you. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You should have thought of that before. I sat there frozen as he stormed out of the room. I could hear him moving around the house, slamming doors, muttering angrily under his breath. When he finally left the house, the sound of the door slamming behind him echoed in my ears. The next few days were a blur. John refused to speak to me, and when he finally did, it was only to tell me he was leaving. I can't stay here, he said, his voice hollow. I can't even look at you. I didn't try to stop him. What could I say? What could I do? When he walked out that door, it felt like the world crumbled beneath me. Now I sit alone in the house that used to feel so warm, so full of life. It's quiet now, unbearably so. I've tried to distract myself to move on, but the weight of my mistakes is always there, pressing down on me. I lost everything because of one moment of weakness. My husband, my family, my sense of who I was. And the worst part? I have no one to blame but myself. This is where my story ends. But let me ask you this. What would you have done in my place? Would you have been stronger than me? Wiser? Or would you have made the same mistakes? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious to hear your thoughts.